My name is Hugh Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities at the University of Miami. And it's my great pleasure to have you here this evening to hear a book talk by David Kling. But before I turn it over to Dan Powles, who'll be introducing Professor Kling, just want to say a few things about how this will work and announce a couple of events that will be coming up. First of all, we'll be holding questions till the end. And in order to ask a question, you can wave your mouse around the bottom and you'll see the Q&A button and click on that. And you can type in your question and answer a question at any point, and then we'll come to that at the end. We'll also be putting a link for where you can buy the book in short order. Now, turning to upcoming events, our next event is Thursday, April 8th at 7 o'clock with Professor Marina Magloire of the English department. And she'll be talking about the spirit writing of Lucille Clifton. And then our next and final book talk of the year on Wednesday, April 14th, back at 8 o'clock, will be by Logan Connors of Modern Languages and Literatures. And he'll be talking about his book, The Emergence of a Theatrical Science of Men. All right, with that said, I'll now turn it over to Professor Powles, who will be introducing our speaker.
Good evening. I'm delighted to have a chance to get myself in focus here to introduce my colleague, David Kling, to all of you who are watching via Zoom as our featured speaker this evening. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to read my introduction because for me, that's the best way to make sure that I keep to the wise 5-minute limit that the center has set on introductions. And if I extemporize, I'll go longer. So let me mostly read this. David Kling is, first of all, a colleague that every professor would want to have in the office next door. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, our shared alma mater, where he worked with the Dean of American Religious Historians, Martin E. Marty. In 1986, he came to UM. So if I count correctly, David is marking his 35th year on the Coral Gables campus and in the Books and Books neighborhood. Congratulations, David. He started in our administration, the office of the Vice Provost, but in 1994, the Department of Religious Studies kidnapped him. With an appointment as assistant professor, he was soon promoted to associate in 2000 and tenured then, and in 2006, he became a full professor. Already in his graduate years, David took a keen interest in religion as a shaping force in American cultural and social life. His dissertation on the religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening won a prize even before it became a book. A Field of Divine Wonders, the New Divinity and Village Revivals in Northwestern Connecticut, 1792 to 1822, won the Kenneth Scott Latourette Prize in 1992 for the nation's best book manuscript in religion and modern history. It appeared with the Penn State imprint the following year. With religious revivals under his microscope, David naturally took an interest in Jonathan Edwards, America's greatest native-born theologian. Along with articles and book reviews, David co-edited Jonathan Edwards at Home and Abroad, Historical Memories, Cultural Movements, and Global Horizons. His second book, published in 2003. While working on Edwards, he also traveled a wider path in Western intellectual and religious history, focusing on what was central to revivals, biblical texts and their cultural impact. The Bible in History, How the Texts Have Shaped the Times, published by Oxford University Press in 2006, was a sizable tome in its own right. Soon after his third book, he was honored by Walter de Gruyter Publishing House in Europe with an appointment as the American area editor of the imposing Encyclopedia of the Bible and its Reception. This is a daunting project of truly Teutonic proportions. Now up to volume 18 of 30, David has been a central figure in its operations, both as contributor and editor since 2009. During this interval, as if he did not have enough to do, David in 2012 became our department chair. Today, nearly 10 years on, he continues to hold that post. This near decade stands as a monument either to his infinite patience or blind folly. I'm not sure which. What I am sure of is that he has been for all of us an astute and steady leader, mentor, friend, generous colleague, allowing us to flourish. Back to scholarship finally, and the reason we're here this evening. David has now capped, but by no means ended, his research journey with something few of us ever attempt, let alone achieve: a truly needed and very big book. A History of Christian Conversion, published this past year, runs to 852, I believe that's correct, pages, and has become the definitive work in the field. David will tell you best, but I will at least say as a final word that in it he explores with extraordinary range and depth one of the most important historical events, a better word would be processes in the human story, the global encounter of Christianity with other religions and cultures of the world. David's book is truly an ambitious work examining Christianity's encounter with the world for both good and ill on a grand scale over the longue durée. Fernand Braudel would have been pleased to introduce my colleague and friend David Kling. So am I, and he, I hope, will be equally pleased to introduce this book. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Hugh and the Humanities Center, and thank you to Dan for that all too generous introduction. I want to begin by noting that I grew up in a world of Christian conversion, where, as my colleague Bill Green likes to say, religion matters. As the son of a Protestant evangelical pastor, I lived in a subculture where conversion was the sine qua non of religious life. Growing up, what I knew of the phenomenon was pretty much restricted to what I had witnessed. Indeed, testimony has always been big in the evangelical experience, or what I had read about, accounts either written by the converted or by sympathetic observers that intended to demonstrate how God miraculously changed the sinner into a saint. Now, fast forward 15 years or so, it's one thing to be exposed to conversion experientially, but it's another to examine it academically or critically. Fortunately, in a graduate seminar at the University of Chicago, I came to see that the subject of conversion was worthy of academic inquiry in its own right. So you won't be getting any testimonies from me tonight, just academic inquiry. That would lead me, and Professor Pals referred to it, to write a dissertation and eventually book on what is known as a Second Great Awakening in New England, a series of religious revivals in the early decades of the 19th century. Although this world was far removed from my own experience, it nevertheless remained a product of American Protestant Christianity. Of course, I knew there was a history of Christian conversion well beyond New England or America or Europe. But ironically, when I pursued a degree in the history of Christianity, I wasn't exposed to world Christianity. In the 1970s, and I think this was typical of graduate programs around the country, the history of Christianity was pretty much limited to the West. So When I took on this project, I had never done any serious investigation into the Christian presence in Latin America, Africa, China, or India, those continents or subcontinents that would eventually take up 9 chapters of the book. How then was I to approach the history of Christian conversion on a global scale? 2 basic questions inform my work. First, what is conversion? Well, it's a word, although in some non-Western cultures, there is no linguistic equivalent. Moreover, as a matter of fact, there are some scholars who reject the word for being too Eurocentric because missionaries use the term in a specific way, imposing cultural categories of personal belief that were foreign to some cultures. But it's not only a word, it's also a concept referring to the process of turning. How is this process portrayed or understood by biblical writers? By 9th century Scandinavians, by 16th century Chinese Mandarins, by 19th century African-American ex-slaves, or by low caste and tribal groups in 20th century India. Viewed by many people today, conversion is associated with what I knew in my early years, a particular strand of modern evangelical Christianity and a particular kind of individual experience, sudden, emotional, even dateable. But when examined over 2 millennia, conversion is a phenomenon far more complex than any one-dimensional profile would suggest. The meaning of the word and the concept itself varies from person to person, from group to group, from setting to setting. My second question, under what circumstances or conditions do people turn to Christianity? For the historian, of course, context is everything. A host of factors, social, cultural, political, religious, etc., determine both the possibility of conversion and the nature of conversion itself. So what is it? Well, it's a turning from something to something, again, oftentimes reduced to the simple phrase, from sin to salvation. But there's much more. As narrated in the New Testament and throughout Christian history, for some that turning may be instantaneous, for others gradual. For some, conversion is an individual affair of the heart. For others, it's an intellectual quest. For some, it's a visibly emotional experience. For others, and this is predominantly the case in traditional societies and in fact, throughout most of Christian history, it's familial, tribal, or communal, a case where people accepted or submitted to the Christian faith. Other questions arise. Is conversion a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence, or is it a process? In his Confessions, Augustine cites no less than 6 moments of conversion. His famous garden scene conversion is the culmination of that process. In general, Catholic writers have emphasized a 2-fold progression from a first conversion at baptism to a second conversion in actualizing what the Christian has already received. For social reformers such as Walter Rauschenbusch, associated with the social gospel in America, and Gustavo Gutierrez, associated with liberation theology in Latin America, a personal commitment to Christianity was the first step that led eventually to a more complete conversion in challenging socio-political structures. As the Puritan Thomas Shepard advised his congregation, be always converting and be always converted. How far does one need to turn to become a true believer? What level of commitment is necessary? Indeed, what counts as conversion? How much of the old must be discarded for the new? Does conversion to Christianity mean giving up divination or amulets or polygamy or ancestor veneration? How about deathbed or gallows conversions? When the Protestant reformer Martin Luther toured Saxony in 1528, he commented, "Dear God, help us! What misery I have seen! The common man knows nothing about Christianity, and unfortunately, Many pastors are practically unfit and incompetent to teach. Nevertheless, they are called Christians, have been baptized, and enjoy the sacraments. They live like animals and unreasoned sows. That's Luther. One way to address the question of what counts is to view conversion within a continuum. For example, in the early medieval period, the years 500 to 1000 or so, at a bare minimum, conversion meant a transfer of loyalty or allegiance, not the kind of inner transformation that the modern era views as the norm. To most church authorities, the initiating rite of baptism simply confirmed one's conversion. But we can raise the bar a bit higher. Medieval conversion also represented a conscious acknowledgement or public profession of the more powerful Christian God over weaker traditional pagan deities. Beyond that, if there was rudimentary instruction, conversion meant familiarity with the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the acceptance of church authority. In the monastic context, conversion meant the voluntary entry into the ascetic life of the monastery. Conversio was oftentimes used to designate taking penance. Finally, conversion could mean a more intense and committed faith that distinguished nominal adherence from a personally dedicated faith. And indeed, throughout Christian history, this notion became a subversive and divisive idea if used in prophetic judgment to separate true or authentic Christians from those Christian in name only. Not only is what counts as conversion problematic, but who determines what counts? Is it the subject? The group the convert joins, the Christian authorities, the scholar? Is conversion any more than what a convert or faith group says it is? Some scholars are reticent to propose a baseline for judging Christian conversion. One historian of late antiquity observes, there may be a universally valid and unchanging answer to the question, but the historian can only note the uncertainties, the shifts, the doubts, and debates concerning it. A very different perspective is offered by another historian who proposes what he calls an objectivist standard by which to evaluate conversion. At a minimum, he argues, conversion signals, quote, a belief in individual redemption through the suffering and death of Christ. Rather than view conversion as a moving target whose definition is contingent upon historical circumstances, as that previous definition, better to begin with a definition and judge the moving target by that definition. Without this baseline, he argues, there is no meaningful way to distinguish between whether an individual or group is Christian, marginally Christian, or non-Christian. If indeed conversion is the move from something to something, what is the distance of that move? Scholars have proposed several categories to delineate this movement. There is what is called tradition transition. This is a change from a non-Christian religion to Christianity. Tradition transition represents a major break or rupture from the past, say from one of the major religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, to Christianity. Other types of conversion involve a change from one Christian community to another, say converting from being a Methodist to a Catholic. This is called institutional transition, or it could be a change from little or no religious commitment to involvement within the Christian community. This is referred to as affiliation. Or at the other end of the spectrum, there is deconversion or apostasy, the rejection of one's Christian commitment. And there may also be fluidity to these. Let me illustrate from the first chapter of the book, where I use my father's conversion account as a way of illuminating the issues, themes, and theories of conversion. His conversion was a combination of institutional transition and affiliation. First, his baptism and confirmation in the Lutheran Church identified him as a Christian. There was no single moment of decision, no heart-wrenching emotional experience, baptism, instruction, examination, a process, not an instantaneous datable event, culminated in his confirmation of Christian faith into the community. Was he converted? From the perspectives of the teachings of the Lutheran Church, of course he was. However, as my father would observe in his short autobiography, he had not yet personalized the faith and thus never had what he called true belief. He had not experienced what he called an intimacy with God. That would come 6 years later at age 18, when after an invitation from a friend to a young people's gathering at church, he was, as he expressed it, born again. Some of you will know that this is what William James calls the twice-born experience in his classic analysis of conversion and the varieties of religious experience. Let me note other challenging issues. The availability of sources. From the 2nd century and well into the early medieval period, sources are fragmentary, scattered, often unreliable. Of course, when sources are available, they need to be evaluated. How does one assess second or third-hand accounts of conversion? Who's writing about the conversion experience? The convert, the missionary, a Christian leader? Why are they writing about it? And when are they writing it in relation to the experience itself? What do they want to convey? We know that memory is selective when reconstructing events and experiences. Applied to conversion, one historian observes, the conversion account, never disinterested, is a condensed or disguised description of the convert's present, which he or she legitimizes through his or her retrospective creation of a past and a self. Let me return to Augustine and fill in this comment. His culminating conversion occurred in the summer of 386, but not until a decade later did he write his Confessions, wherein he wrote down his conversion experience. In the intervening years, over a decade, he studied the scriptures, wrote theological treatises, established a monastery, was ordained a priest and then a bishop. In the years between his conversion and his written account, he had time to reflect on his past and the events that led up to this point in his life. Memory comes into play. What's remembered of the past? What's important? Why is it important? One of the ways that Augustine's present shaped his account of the past is in his appropriation of the Apostle Paul. Up until 386, Augustine understood Paul primarily as a Christian Neoplatonic philosopher. What truth he found in the Platonist, he found in Paul's writings. Paul's discussion of the inner man of the spirit and the outer man of the flesh, human free will, and the ascent of the soul to its source resonated with Augustine's Neoplatonism. But by the time he writes his Confessions, he understands Paul differently and himself differently. In the Confessions, Augustine portrays not only Paul the philosopher who enlightens the mind, but also Paul the theologian who exposes sin. He appropriates Paul's language and concepts to understand the inner spiritual struggles of his own life. In short, he has come to explain his own past history through a specific Pauline lens, making much of sin what he called concupiscence. Again, here is a retrospective creation of a past. Finally, let me turn to the problem of conversion. There are those who find any reference to Christian conversion problematic. For them, and this includes not only those outside the Christian community, but certainly a sizable number inside as well, conversion implies the forceful efforts, whether physical or verbal, by zealous believers to impose their faith on others. In their minds, conversion to Christianity is a colonization of consciousness, or it conjures up images of crusading armies, inquisitions, religious wars, the white man's religion, colonialism, imperialism, and present-day fundamentalism. Certainly, these aspects of history cannot be minimized or glossed over. One of the chapters in the book deals explicitly with conversion by coercion, and I take up the issue in other places throughout, especially in discussing colonial Latin America and in Africa. However, if these aspects remain the only focus of attention, then they vastly distort the larger picture. To cite evidence from the last half century, the unanticipated and largely overlooked Christian resurgence in the non-West, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and China, has been a post-colonial, local, and indigenous phenomenon, largely independent of Western missionary influence. The transmission and diffusion of Christianity has rarely been a one-sided affair impressed upon passive or solely reactive agents. One African scholar argues that the missionary has, quote, the rank of secondary importance, whereas African agency in the dissemination of Christianity is a major category in the transmission of the religion, close quote. In short, most Christian converts heard the Christian message from other Africans. Millions of people have embraced the Christian faith not because of threat or coercion or because a colonial power imposed Christianity upon them, but due to a variety of inducements and motivations. To be sure, the range of choices may be limited, as are all choices insofar as they are bounded by time, place, social location, etc. Depending on the circumstances and needs, people converted initially to Christianity for personal reasons. It offered new meaning, a new way of life, a sense of dignity and hope, a source of social change, the truth for which they were seeking, a sense of belonging, protection from malignant spirits, the assurance of a loving, forgiving God, the possibility of being healed, and the promise of eternal life. But people also converted for reasons of political expediency, for material improvement, for reasons of marriage, for educational opportunities, or they followed the head of their household or their political leader, or they converted to escape persecution or death, or they recognized that the Christian God was more powerful than their gods, or divinities. So to summarize, from a historical perspective, there is no unitary single model of conversion, no easily demonstrable process that accounts for why people convert to Christianity. Rather, whether in an individual or group setting, a variety of historical factors, social and cultural influences, and affective states accompany the conversion experience, which is to say, people may convert because it actually addresses the needs of the whole person, spiritual, material, and social. Now let me turn to one way of looking at all this from what might be called a stage model of conversion. To get at the process involved in conversion, I employed a variety of methods and theoretical models. So let me briefly describe one model that I refer to throughout the book and then apply it to the conversion of the Indian Brahmin Pandita Ramabai. In his 1993 book, Understanding Religious Conversion, Louis Rambo outlined a dynamic six-stage model of conversion, really a way to track the process of conversion over time. These stages are sequential, which you see in the middle illustration there. They are sequential, but there is also a back and forth between the stages, as you can see, at least partly see on your right, at least on my right. However, before applying these stages, one must examine the context. Rambo calls this, quote, the most comprehensive of all stages. For an examination of the political, social, cultural, personal, and religious dimensions shapes the nature, structure, and process of conversion. So context is more than a stage. It sets the parameters for the other 6 stages. Let me briefly describe these stages. First, crisis. Typically, some form of crisis precedes conversion. This may be a single crisis or a series of mild crises that trigger or culminate in conversion. Second, quest. Quest is an ongoing process of searching for meaning and purpose. This is an effort to resolve the crisis or the perceived tension. Third, encounter. Enter the advocate of conversion. This could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a missionary, some other person. The encounter between the advocate and the convert is typically a dynamic one, which is to say it can shift from suspicion and resistance to trust and acceptance, etc. Fourth, interaction. After the initial encounter, the interaction with the adopted religious group intensifies. The potential convert learns about the teachings, lifestyle, and expectations of the group. Number 5, commitment. This is the tipping point, if you will, or the fulcrum of the change process. It includes the commitment to accept the faith, rituals, for example, baptism. It includes typically testimony manifested in language transformation. So the convert learns a new vocabulary of the particular group to which he or she has now been a part of. And of course, biographical reconstruction. That is to say, oftentimes some kind of testimony as to what one's life was like before and after one's conversion. Most of you are probably familiar with the hymn, Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. That's the idea. The impact of written narratives of conversion, which accelerated exponentially in the age of print, and public testimonies cannot be overestimated, for they not only give meaning to the life of the testifier, but also bolster the community and draw others into its orbit. Finally, the consequences of conversion. Consequences are determined in part by the nature, intensity, and duration of the conversion and the response to conversion in a person's or a group's context. Here, the issue is how conversion influences a person's intellectual, religious, social, even political life. So, it's sort of the after effects of one's conversion or one's commitment. So 6-stage model. And again, no model is perfect. This works in some cases. It doesn't work so well in other cases. And this applies almost not exclusively, but predominantly to individual converts. One such individual convert I want to now explore and apply this stage model is Pandita Ramabai Sarasvati. You see her dates, mid-19th century to the early decades of the 20th century. Rambo's model helps us track the various overlapping stages in the conversion of Pandita Ramabai, born a high caste Brahmin in India. Like so many in the Christian tradition, she underwent several conversions. From a Hindu perspective, to apostasy by becoming a Christian. She also converted to a form of feminism, which both triggered and reinforced her conversion to Christianity, and then to Christianity itself, where she underwent several turnings. You see in the middle, that's Pandita and her daughter, Manorama. Now I'm going to telescope crisis, quest, encounter, interaction, rather than going through each one individually. I think you'll see as I move through her biography how these fit together and oftentimes overlap. Ramabai's writings complicate the piecing together of these multiple conversions. She wrote 2 autobiographical accounts, one in a letter in 1883 and another in 1907 as a longer account intended for publication. As one might expect, the latter retrospective account imposes a clear pattern on past events, leaving the impression of a linear movement toward Christianity. However, countering these well-ordered accounts and more revealing of the state of her mind in her early journey is her correspondence. Written amid spiritual and emotional turmoil, her letters offer an alternative narrative that I'll note a little bit later. Ramabai lived in India during the rule of the British Crown. She was the daughter of a well-known Sanskrit scholar. When she was 6 years old, the family began an itinerant life after her father decided to become a wandering professional reciter of Hindu epic and mythological texts. He was also a feminist in his own day. He rejected arranged marriages, and contrary to Hindu custom, he was convinced that women should be allowed to read Hindu scriptures in Sanskrit, considered a sacred language, expressly forbidden by tradition to women and those of lower caste. Ramabai was introduced to everything her father knew and taught. She had a prodigious memory, so much so that she went public speaking to mixed audiences. Orphaned at the age of 16 during the Great Famine, she and her brother traveled across India reciting Sanskrit scriptures for the next 4 years. Although, as she would later note, she increasingly lost faith in the gods and in the sacred books. At age 20, Pandita Ramabai became the first woman in India to earn the honorific titles of Pandita, meaning learned woman, and Sarasvati, goddess of learning, after she was examined by the faculty of the University of Calcutta. In Calcutta, she became involved with the Brahmo Samaj, or the Society of Brahman, or the Society of God. This is a reform society that interpreted Hinduism in terms of a kind of Vedantic monotheism, and that even embraced the human Jesus. Their social agenda included the abandonment of polytheism, idolatry, and discrimination based on sex, caste, and creed. Not only was Ramabai befriended by city reformers, but Christians sought her out, invited her to meetings, which she did attend. She rose to fame as a champion of women's education, including the right to read Hindu sacred texts. In 1880, she married a Bengali lawyer of lower caste in a civil ceremony. However, her husband died less than 2 years later, leaving her with a daughter, Manorama. During Ramabai's brief marriage, while the couple lived in Assam, a British missionary friend of her husband's left her a card with the words printed on it, "Incline your heart unto the Lord." This is an Old Testament passage. Reading these words, Ramabai sensed her spiritual emptiness and a need for, quote, "a God who was full of love and compassion," close quote. By now, she had lost not only her former religion, but rejected the Brahmo Samaj. After the missionary visited her again, she resolved, and you see this, "I resolved then, without knowing the reason why, that I would become a Christian," close quote. I should note that unlike other Brahmin converts to Christianity, Ramabai did not need to worry about the loss of caste, the loss of family, and the loss of standing in Hindu society by becoming a Christian. Normally, a family would use every means at its disposal to keep one of their own, especially a female, from converting to Christianity. But Ramabai had no immediate family. In a sense, she had nothing to lose. her situation is actually similar to the structural possibilities for conversion in other contexts. For example, when I wrote about Latin America, several studies indicate that those without local family ties, typically local Catholic family ties, were more open to conversion to Pentecostalism than those with a nearby kinship group. Now let me go to the map here and then I'll go back. So you see Calcutta, now known as Calcutta today, and Assam is up sometimes it's called the neck in India. Okay, and then she will later move from Calcutta to the Bombay area, Pune in particular, probably thanks to the British railway system. Yeah, so in 1882, she moved to Pune, where she founded a society of high caste Hindu women dedicated to the education of girls and opposed to child marriage. In the meantime, her contacts with Christians continued. The principal of a government female training school taught her New Testament in the Marathi language, and a Brahmin convert to Christianity, an Anglo-Catholic missionary, Father Nehemiah Gore, explained to her the differences between the Hindu and Christian religions. In 1883, Ramabai traveled to Britain, where she hoped to study medicine and then return to India as a doctor. With support from the Pune-based sisters of the Community of St. Mary the Virgin, CSMV, Ramabai, her daughter, and a companion, Anandabai Bhagat, traveled to England. They stayed with the sisters in Wantage under the spiritual guidance of Sister Geraldine. At this point in her life, Ramabai's conception of religion was a generic form of theism, perhaps closer to deism. As she noted in her book, Morals for Women, true religion is single in form, namely conduct that is in accordance with one's conscience. You see the layout of this community, pretty impressive. Some sisters there, and then the founder of the sisters, Canon Butler. During her first months in England, two decisive events occurred that influenced Ramabai's decision to receive baptism. First, she visited a home for so-called fallen women run by the sisters. She realized, quote, that something could be done to reclaim the so-called fallen women, and that Christians, whom Hindus considered outcasts and cruel, were kind to these unfortunate women. I began to think that there was a real difference between Hinduism and Christianity, close quote. When asked why the sisters cared for these cast-offs, one of them told her the story of Jesus' love exhibited in his encounter with the Samaritan woman. Ramabai realized that, quote, only the divine savior could transform and uplift the downtrodden womanhood of India and of every land. A second event, more traumatic in its emotional effect on Ramabai, was the suicide of a depressed Bhagat who sensed that baptism was being forced upon her and Ramabai. Bhagat tried to spare both of them by attempting to strangle Ramabai, but when that failed, she committed suicide. Shortly after these harrowing experiences, and after finding out that her own progressing deafness, this was a delayed consequence of the famine, would prevent her from practicing medicine, Ramabai and her daughter received baptism in September of 1883. Commitment. Ramabai never stated the exact reasons leading up to this decision. Two carefully constructed written accounts of her baptism offer few clues. In the first, written just before her baptism, she recounted this: I was by birth a Brahmin. My religion was at first Hinduism. Then for a time I was a theist, believing that theism was taught in the Vedas. In the last 2 months, however, I have accepted Christianity and hope shortly to receive holy baptism. Max Mueller, the Oxford professor of Sanskrit literature and languages with whom Ramabai stayed for some weeks after her baptism, asserted that Ramabai became a Christian, not that she considered her former religion false or mischievous, but because, as she told me, she could no longer stand quite alone. She wanted to belong to somebody, and particularly to be able to worship together with those whom she loved and who had been so kind to her. Understood within the broader context of subsequent conversions that deepened and enlarged her faith, Ramabai's baptism signaled a public declaration of her commitment to Christianity. We may infer that Ramabai submitted to baptism for reasons shared by other converts. They are attracted by the need to belong. This was Mueller's social factor. By the behavior of Christians, the Sisters' Rescue Home, and by reasoned beliefs, the evidence presented to her by Nehemiah Gore. In particular, Ramabai saw in Christianity's ethic of compassion an ally in her goal of relieving the plight of the women of India and fighting Hindu patriarchy. Now, the sisters wanted to claim Ramabai as their prize convert. To their dismay, and to that of the Reverend Canon William Butler, the founder of the CSMV, she refused to conform to Anglo-Catholic religious and cultural expectations. The unvarnished correspondence between Ramabai and Sister Geraldine offers a very different vantage point to view Ramabai's conversion than her carefully constructed autobiography. In exchanges that went on for nearly 35 years, a test of wills and friendship are on full display. Like most Brahmin converts, Ramabai had little patience for denominational distinctions made by what she called uninspired men. She went on, "I shall read the Bible for myself and follow the teachings of Christ." Butler accused her of vanity and deception by the devil. Sister Geraldine repeatedly accused her of self-will and pride. In this clash of cultures and theologies, the English sisters could not escape their imperial prejudices. Pandita had become one of them, but on their terms as a colonized one. They could not fathom how far Ramabai had come in making the leap from Hinduism to Christianity. In one of her letters, Ramabai noted, "You have never gone through the same experience of choosing another religion for yourself, which was totally foreign to you, as I did." By January of 1886, Sister Geraldine had reached the point where she questioned Ramabai's candor and sincerity, her truthfulness, even her conversion. Finally, consequences. After spending 2 years in the United States publicizing the plight of Hindu women and raising funds for establishing a residential school for high caste Hindu child widows in India, Ramabai returned home. She opened a residential school for these widows in Bombay with the pledge to refrain from religious proselytizing. In November of 1890, after Ramabai moved the school from Bombay to Pune, opposition arose to her proselytizing. Although she gave no direct religious instruction and no one was urged to become a Christian, she read her Bible aloud and prayed to the Christian God. When one of the girls turned to Christ, the reaction from the Brahmin community was swift. What was suspected all along now had happened: the unethical proselytization of minors under the guise of a humanitarian project. A storm of protest ensued, and when in 1893, 20 widows expressed their desire to follow Christ, her Hindu friends on her advisory board resigned, and 25 girls were withdrawn. In the end, the abandonment of Hindu friends and continued personal attacks from Hindu nationalists drew Ramabai closer and closer to Western expressions of Christianity. She embraced the teachings of the Keswick movement in England, whose beliefs included a post-conversion experience of what is sometimes referred to as entire sanctification, or the second blessing, or being filled with the Holy Spirit. And following the establishment of the Mukti, meaning salvation, mission to the south of Pune, which took in low-caste famine victims and the elderly and the infirm, Ramabai, her daughter, and members of the community experience Pentecostal-like phenomenon, healings, visions, prophesying, tongue speech, etc. This came after Ramabai instituted a prayer meeting, quote, for a special outpouring of the Holy Spirit on all Christians of every land. Finally, conclusion. Ramabai's exposure to Western forms of Christianity triggered and shaped her spiritual turnings, and yet it is clear that she appropriated these on her own culture-specific terms. This was even more so in the case of other 19th century upper caste converts. You see pictures, these are others that are featured in the book, much more radical really than Ramabai in terms of their attempt to integrate their Indianness into the Christian faith. So what developed was a kind of cultural hybridity, a kind of Indiization of Christianity, efforts to build a bridge between Hinduism and Christianity. And to be sure, clashes and quarrels between the colonizer and the colonized were frequent. Once established in their commitment to Christianity, converts made explicit efforts to nationalize or indigenize the faith, to separate Christ from the trappings of Western colonial Christianity and make it India appropriate. As one convert told the missionaries, this is Narayan Vaman Tilak, as he told the missionaries, keep all your doctrines to yourselves alone, but let us first find Christ. This search, as he understood it, was the true meaning of conversion. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that excellent talk, which I think also illustrates your own intellectual journey, starting out in the Second Great Awakening and expanding so broadly. I remind people that to ask questions, we'll ask you to type them into the Q&A. So go ahead and do that at your leisure. Fortunately, we have a couple of questions to start off with. One of these from Ron Bacon was asked before the talk. He says, are there themes you identified that run throughout the history of Christian conversion? You talked about a lot about differences and processes. Are there themes, are there similarities one could also talk about?
That's a very good question. And in the conclusion of the book, I take up a number of these themes. Let me note a couple of them that I mentioned in the conclusion. One is the issue of gender. For men and women, the process of conversion oftentimes discloses gendered roles or expectations of a religious community or a culture. Let me give you a couple quick examples. One is, comes from 5th century Syria. The prostitute Pelagia's conversion followed the ideal of the ascetic celibate life. But in her case, celibacy required not only sexual renunciation, but also a transvestite identity. So in a world of Syrian Christianity, no one but a male could attain the heights of holiness. So sexuality became the great divide between purity and danger, if you will. So Pelagia left Syria, settled on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, became a reclusive monk. She called herself Pelagios from Pelagia, and only upon her death was it discovered that he was a she. So that's just one example. More recently, I'll give you an example from Latin America, where women played very active roles as advocates of evangelical conversion. Oftentimes, they were the first to convert, and as because of their influence, husband, children, and others would follow. And here I refer to the findings of the anthropologist Elizabeth Brusco in a work entitled The Reformation of Machismo. And it's a very important book for understanding the consequences of conversion for domestic life. In short, the double standard of sexual morality that men live by would cease upon conversion. The converted husbands would give up drinking, gambling, and consequently would redirect squandered money to the home. And what you see here are the boundaries of the husband and wife redrawn. So gender is one of them. I'll mention one other, and that is the issue of identity in the self. When we think of the self, or in almost modern terms, the authentic self, we typically think of self-sufficiency, we think of self-determination, we think of a kind of inwardness. But the fact of the matter is, up until the modern period, which is to say, throughout most of human history, the social unit, not the individual, defined one's identity. So, and I referred to this before, conversion typically took place within the context of the family or the community or the clan or the tribe. I've mentioned Augustine. Certainly one can detect autobiography and that inwardness in Augustine, but he is very much the exception to the rule. It's not until really the 18th century does the autobiography emerge, and that of course is tied to literacy, does a new understanding of the self emerge. And this is particularly predominant among the Puritans and then subsequent Christians in the West. There is a kind of, how should I put it, a sense of individuation, giving voice to the work of God in the soul. And indeed, the validity of human experience is a kind of proof positive of divine work. This is new stuff. Certainly you can find traces of it in the past, but this notion of the self, the independent, authentic self, is very much a modern idea. And it was actually exported then by Western missionaries to other places, so that the modern conception of the individual person was very much related to the project of conversion outside of the West. So those two in particular. I also deal with issues related to music and how music plays an important role in conversion. Also the body itself, the body as a site of conversion. I won't say any more about that, but yes, there are some themes, some motifs that run through. Not always consistently, but those are a couple that I identified.
Thanks. You mentioned that you have a part of the book on issues of coercion and colonization and so forth. And this is a question that draws off of that and is a little bit more specific. The questioner asks, I thought in South India, conversion was pressured. Poor families that could not afford to feed their kids were told that they will be fed and taken care of when parents converted. Do you do research in that area?
Yep. Sometimes it's called rice conversions in China. There was certainly some of that. There is no question about it, but it's very interesting. I'll give you one example of an outcast group in Punjab. They were the Shuras. They converted as a group, and their conversion was initiated and transmitted and really sustained at the grassroots level by these outcasts themselves. So they went to Christian missionaries. Again, Shuras were the lowest of the low. They spread manure, they cleaned latrines, they removed the dead animals from the fields, executed condemned criminals, et cetera, not allowed to draw water from common wells. Even their shadows were polluting to Hindus, upper caste Hindus. And this is an example of a group conversion. They often experienced intimidation and violence from landowners that feared that they would move out of their station by converting to the Christian faith. What is interesting is that the missionaries were reluctant to come to their aid with food and all the rest, because they viewed there are exceptions, but in this particular area, these were Presbyterian missionaries. They were reluctant to provide any aid because they viewed this as a time of testing. All right, so if you're going to convert simply by being given food, what is the integrity of that conversion? So these Presbyterians were very aware of it. And so in fact, conversion did very little to mitigate their economic conditions. What it did was to change their self-understanding by providing a greater sense of dignity, a greater sense of self-respect. So, I mean, yes, can you find examples where families converted by, you might reduce it to bribes. Certainly there was some of that, but there are certainly other cases where conversion came about under very different circumstances among, again, very low caste or outcast groups.
We're a little after 9, but I think we have time for a response to that and then one last question. And the response is, on a flight to India, I was being pressured to convert to Christianity. I had to tell the Reverend that I believe in reincarnation and have been born in different religions in different lifetimes. And my soul learned what it has to be from each one, or what it has to from each one, sorry. In this lifetime, I have chosen to be Hindu, and I believe in coexistence of different religions.
So what is the question?
There's not a question, that was just a response.
Oh, a comment, yeah. Well, the fact of the matter is there's been a great deal of discussion among Christians and Hindus. I mean, this has been ongoing, particularly since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. There has been these efforts, these ecumenical efforts to bridge the divide and find commonalities among not only Hindus, but Buddhists and those of other faiths. And a recognition of, I mean, again, you can find a whole continuum among the most fundamental of fundamentalists. They would damn them to hell, but among others who view things very differently, Christians who view things very differently, they would admit the integrity of their religions and not judge them in that kind of way.
Thanks. And then the last question. I'm struck by Pandita Ramabai's encounter where she meets a missionary and says, I resolved then without knowing the reason that I would become Christian. There's something mysterious here, as if a person at the encounter stage is captivated by or feels inexplicably drawn to a religion. Sorry about that. Is it common for converts to describe this stage of a calling of some kind?
That's a really good question. What I gave you was certainly a very clipped perspective on Pandita. To me, in reading her accounts, and there are several of them, what struck me, and it came out in Max Mueller's comment, she found herself alone. And after the death of her husband, she made the very same comment, I found myself alone. And I think that sense of aloneness was addressed, at least in part for her, by the Christian community. So there is, certainly you could find examples of others who were alone but did not find Christianity particularly compelling. But in Pandita Ramabai's case, it certainly was compelling, yeah.
Okay, and I think I am going to slip in one last question, but that'll have to be it. There's not much difference between Islamic conversion and Christian conversion. Islamic conversion was a threat of life or imposition of special tariff, whereas Christianity was using coercion by providing medicines and food to the poor, backed by the tremendous Catholic Christian church's money and power, as in South India and North India. Take on this.
Yeah, certainly that was the case. I don't think you can separate the good aspects, and you could debate what I mean by good, but the good aspects of Western civilization, its education, its medicine, that saved hundreds and hundreds of lives from then the desire on the part of some to gravitate towards a Christian faith. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I do wonder about the statement about Islam. My understanding of Islam is that if one simply says the creed, there is no God but Allah, and Allah is, and Muhammad is his prophet, if you can say that with all sincerity, you are essentially a Muslim convert. Now, I may be wrong, but that's my understanding of things. And I suppose, you know, if you simply reduce Christianity to the statement on the part of the jailer that encountered Paul and Silas, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved, right? So the question is, what when you begin to go beneath the surface, what exactly does that mean? And what you find throughout Christian history are indeed many, many answers, many complexities in trying to unravel that.
Well, thanks very much, David. And thanks to everyone for attending. As I say, basically at the end of every one of these talks, one bad thing about webinars is it's always hard to express one's appreciation by applauding. So I do it for the we hope you will return to other events, those of you in the audience. And once again, David, thanks so much for this interesting talk.
Thank you.